G'day, welcome to another episode of the Pier Review. If you watched the first episode, you would have heard of this scientist, eco-philosopher that we're going to be reviewing today, because we're going to take a peer review of a scientific paper written by Dr. Larelle Bossi, who is an eco-philosopher who specialises in bioethics and ecofeminism. Now, Dr. Bossi is a research fellow at the Institute of Ethics, Law and Governance at Griffith University. Now, whereas Mr. Spock from Star Trek would claim that science must not be based on any emotion and must be based purely on logic, recent research has expanded our understanding of science in that we need to consider some emotion in it, particularly in terms of wonder and passion. But I wonder if too much emotion can skew the analysis, and if so, then we might have a problem. So it's largely through this lens that we're going to examine a piece of Dr. Bossi's research. I'm also going to put my English teacher and aquaculture educator's hat on, and for this one, and with red pen in hand, let's begin. This paper is entitled "How a Sense of Place May Return the Social Licence to Operate Concept Back to an Ethics Responsibility Within a Neoliberal Framework. Tasmanian Salmon Story." Phew, that's a mouthful.
"12 seconds later."
And it's chapter 3 of a wider work entitled "Social Licence and Ethical Practices," edited by Hugh Breakey. I wonder if his nickname's Akey. Now, if you want to know more about the concept of social licence, you can check out a video of a webinar I presented to the Seafood Summit Australia Winter Series in 2021. I'll put the link in the description below. And one of the scientists I cite there, Emily Ogier from IMAS, also contributed to a 2014 paper which stated, "Scientists have a substantial role in the processes that constitute social licence." So with that in mind, let's have a look at Bossi's paper. She begins, and I quote, "I remember when I first cruised by the feeding lots in Macquarie Harbour 12 years ago. Never having seen a fish farm before, nor expecting it in Tasmania's aesthetically pristine environment, I was unsure what these giant black plastic pens were. But I began to cry. Not sobbing tears, but a remorseful weep. It was more a bodily reaction to human guilt for transposing our terrestrial oppression to the unseeable beneath the surface." Oh dear. Emotion? Now, notwithstanding Bossi's intent to explore the ontological significance of salmon farming in southern Tasmania, by which she means their impact on a metaphysical sense of being, she still uses research, facts and evidence to support her hypothesis. And it's that evidence that we're going to focus on. She starts by saying she didn't realise that they were Atlantic salmon and assumed they were Australian salmon, Arapus trutta, which she references as belonging to the Perciform order of fish. But Arapus trutta actually belonged to the Scombriform order of fish. So that's a basic scientific mistake right there on page 1. And on page 28, she makes the first of a number of references to Richard Flanagan's book Toxic, which, whatever side of the debate you're on, would not be regarded as a reliable scientific source. I mean, she even cites Flanagan as the source of information about the life cycle of wild Atlantic salmon. I reckon Wikipedia would have more depth of information and more credibility on that topic. And while on the topic of fiction writers, Dr. Bossi also cites Charles Dickens. Dickens? D-I-C-K-I-N-S? I'm hoping that C does not stand for fermented apple juice. Or maybe she was referring to another author.
Oh, I wonder if you have a copy of Barnaby Budge.
Now, as I say, we're right out of Edmund Wells.
No, not Edmund Wells, Charles Dickens.
Charles Dickens?
Yes.
You mean Barnaby Rudge?
No, Barnaby Budge by Charles Dickens. That's Dickens with 2 Ks, the well-known Dutch author.
Now, I'm not sure if Dr. Bossi has spent time in or is from Canada. Her accent doesn't seem to be North American. Yet she refers in her bio on the Griffith University website as contributing to the Salmon Folk podcast, which is from Canada. Yet, strangely, and look, I've previously subscribed to that podcast and listened to all of the episodes, but I can't recall her name or anyone from Australia speaking. When I double checked back on their website, where it breaks down in each episode and lists the contributors, her name didn't appear. Oh well, but she does harp on a lot about Canada and the place of Atlantic salmon there. I mean, it's only coincidence that Tasmanian farmed Atlantic salmon came from Canada, with all of our fish descended from 35 fish brought in the 1960s from Nova Scotia to the Gaydon hatchery in Jindabyne in the Snowy Mountains of New South Wales. And it was only 20 years later, in the 1980s, that over were brought to the Tasmanian Fisheries Development Authority laboratory at Taroona. And if you want to find out more about that, watch my history of my father. And it is coincidence because they weren't the first Atlantic salmon that were brought to Tasmania, because back in the 1850s, batch after batch of salmon ova were brought to Tasmania from Scotland, hatched out at places such as the salmon ponds at Plenty, and released into the rivers as smolt. And they all swam back to Scotland. No, because if our salmon were from Scotland or Norway, a lot of what comes next wouldn't stand up, if it does at all. Bossi says, quote, "How does Tasmanian Atlantic salmon make any sense, even theoretically?" Well, about as much sense as King Island beef and Flinders Island lamb, I guess. But she continues, quote, "Not the local Arapus. Our Atlantic salmon is a Canadian salmon from Nova Scotia. Wild salmon, plamu, have always been and still are an important species to the First Nations communities of North America. And in the connection to Nova Scotia, to the Micmac people of the southeast of Canada. Plamu contributed to the sustainability of the Micmac peoples as a staple food that was dependable, predictable, and could be found in most rivers in Nova Scotia. This seasonal harvest and feasting was founded upon a sustainable relationship with the plamu, which sits at the core of their mythology." Well, yeah, and what about the people on the other side of the Atlantic? You know, the Europeans? Or are the Micmac more romantically or esoterically spiritual? So notwithstanding the coincidence that our salmon came from Canada, Bossi now spends an incredible amount of time on discussing the significance of the Atlantic salmon to First Nations people of Canada. She then swings its significance to the First Nations people of Tasmania. Now, I must admit, I got my hackles up when I read on page 37, quote, "I occupy a country of people recognised by the UN as the only genocidal culture in the world." So why does that statement make me angry? First up, because the Palawa people of Tasmania still exist, as do elements of their culture. But also because the statement is wrong, as a simple Google search would uncover. The UN has not recognised the colonial so-called Black Wars in Tasmania as a genocide. Although it is claimed that Raphael Lemkin, who determined the definition of genocide, which was later adopted in the UN Genocide Convention, himself considered the case of Tasmania to be one of genocide. as was cited by Tasmanian historian Henry Reynolds in his 2001 book An Indelible Stain. But after raising my hackles by suggesting that there are no Tasmanian Aboriginal people left, Dr. Bossi then goes on to consider the relationship to place and creatures experienced by today's Tasmanian First Nations people. She does this largely through reference to a paper written by Tasmanian Aboriginal Heritage Officer Fiona Hamilton. Now, a brief aside, I once worked with the very well-respected Tasmanian Aboriginal educator Arthur Hamilton, and Tasmania being Tasmania, I'm sure that Fiona is related to Arthur, who has sadly passed away. And I mean no disrespect, personally or culturally, for what I'm about to say. Now, Hamilton's paper was impossible to find through Google, ResearchGate or Google Scholar, leading me to question not Fiona Hamilton's integrity, but Dr. Bossi's referencing, implying that this is a published piece of research. Bossi cites Hamilton as saying, and I quote, "And nothing good can grow on country without the ability to derive a proper social licence to operate from country, both in terms of presence of being and activity, but also in terms of a clear understanding that the health of your product reflects the quality of your relationships with the country and with the people." But this poses a number of questions. Firstly, Aboriginal Tasmanians did not farm in the sense that we understand it today. They managed landscapes, certainly, for example with fire, to encourage grass growth and in turn animals such as wallabies, which they would use for food. So, are we now to consider that the concept of growing on country now includes modern agriculture? And is there a First Nations perspective on cattle or sheep farming? Now, having worked with an agriculture trainer and farmer from another prominent Tasmanian Aboriginal family, I can say that I've never heard him speak of one, or any of the people that he worked with. And he certainly didn't express comparative opinions about the salmon we grew. Now, later Hamilton is cited as saying that Atlantic salmon are the wrong fish with the wrong song. Now, while the concept of sea country certainly exists, historically Tasmanian Aboriginal people did not have a relationship with any finfish. They didn't eat finfish, and taking only shellfish and crustaceans from the sea. So did all finfish have the wrong song? So what I'm saying is, I think it's drawing a long bow to say that modern First Nations Tasmanians have an on-country relationship with a farmed, in the European concept, non-native finfish, the Atlantic salmon. Or is Dr. Bossi correct in saying that traditional First Nations culture was destroyed by genocide and the modern culture is, I don't know. But for a deeper understanding of this new First Nations culture, consider this from page 42, where Hamilton is cited, and I quote, "When I think about the salmon industry as a First Nations person, as a sovereign for my sea country, as a black woman, I can't help but to see things through the salmon's eyes. I imagine myself swimming in places where I'm forced to be, but have no relationship with the people or other kinship ties to the creatures around me. I am caged. I'm fed, not for myself or for sustainability, but as a product. When I escape, I'm hunted, while other creatures who attempt to incur within my pen are brutalised. I'm one of many, but I'm alone, and I witness the country around me disintegrate and become toxic, and I feel it is my fault. I'm alive, but I'm not living. I'm living a life to escape death. There is no song that the women can sing to me to ease my suffering, because I'm not home, because I don't belong. I am sickness. I carry my sickness in my body and cannot free myself of it. I can only transmit it. I never gave up my social licence to be put upon in the country of these women in this way. I am understood in my pen in the same way that black women are understood within colonialism." Wow. Now, I know the debate about whether fish are sentient has been long resolved, But I'm not sure that the average farm salmon is having those thoughts. I mean, where did the fish learn about colonialism and the treatment of black women? In a school? Boom, boom. The only thing they do have in common is that they're all female. So enough of the big picture concepts. Let's go through and see if we can find any more of the factual errors. On page 31, Dr. Bossi says, quote, "Worth over $1 billion annually, the salmon industry is the biggest industry in the island of Tasmania." I mean, really? The biggest industry? No. Construction is the biggest industry in Tasmania, worth $9.7 billion a year. The salmon industry is one part of the wider agriculture, forestry and fishing industry, which is worth $4.9 billion a year and is only the fifth biggest. And if you want to separate out the salmon industry itself, its $1 billion worth is, as a standalone industry, it would only be the 18th biggest industry. So the biggest industry? Wrong, Dr. Bossi. And something that you could have easily have checked. On page 38, while waxing lyrical about the existentialist joy of living amongst the pristine environment, surrounded by a unique native species, Dr. Bossi says, and I quote, "I'm woken by the laughter of kookaburras in the rainbow trees at the crack of dawn." Kookaburras are not native to Tasmania. They were in fact brought here, introduced from mainland Australia by white settlers in 1906. And if we want to extrapolate that out, considering that the Scottish Atlantic salmon were in Tasmanian waters in the 1850s, and admittedly they swam back to Scotland, we could say that Atlantic salmon are more native to Tasmania than kookaburras are. But that would mess with Dr. Bossi's sense of place, wouldn't it? On page 42, Bossi states that fish are not covered by animal ethics legislation in Tasmania. That's simply not true. The Animal Welfare Act states that an animal is A, any live vertebrate animal other than a human being, and B, any other creature prescribed for the purposes of any of all of the provisions of this Act. And last time I looked, when filleting a fish, they do have a backbone. And that's a pretty easy thing to find out. So what is Bossi's source for that? Well, she cites Officer 2021. And when we go to the references, we find that Officer 2021 is actually a form, an animal ethics form. I mean, is this really the way we should be citing references? But let's look a little bit deeper into these references. Plato, 2006. I liked his old stuff better than his new stuff.
I like your old stuff better than your new stuff. I like your old stuff better than your new stuff.
On page 34, Bossi says, the Tasmanian salmon situation concerning the salmon industry is certainly one where the concept of sovereignty of state has been replaced by the new corporate sovereignty, which is unrestricted or unaccountable. Here are just some of the restrictions and accountability requirements applying to aquaculture in Tasmania. Unrestricted and unaccountable? Wrong, Dr. Bossi, and a simple thing to have checked. On page 34, Dr. Bossi writes, quote, talk still to the university researchers whose work is bound to the industry and lips sealed even tighter. Now, this is one of the myths that's often put out by activists, that scientists whose work is funded by industry are not free to speak. In my experience, that's not the case. This is Associate Professor Jeff Ross from IMAS.
It was acknowledged from everyone that there were some clear signs of stress. The system was talking back to us and telling us that, you know, it's not coping at the moment. And I think
I was once part of an IMAS community consultative group. Yeah, yes, Dr. Bossi, you know that community that you say are not consulted? The group was made up of a range of people. There were people from environmental groups, there were activists, there were educators, and there were general members of the community. At one meeting, when introducing his recent work on the benthic state of Macquarie Harbour, Professor Ross spoke very directly to the representative of Environment Tasmania, one of the key activist groups campaigning against salmon farming. And he said that if ET continued to misquote and misrepresent his science in their campaign against salmon farming, then he would no longer share it with them. Lips sealed by industry? More likely, lips closed in frustration when science is misrepresented. But let's bring Dr. Bossi's claim a little closer back home. Now, she conducts work for the Blue Economy CRC, based at UTAS, and was recently involved in a project around social licence in salmon aquaculture. The project was partially funded by TASAL, and a member of the steering group was the head of environment for TASAL, Sean Riley. So Dr. Bossi herself has been paid by industry. And have her lips been sealed? Clearly not. So people who live in glass fish tanks, I guess. Now, we touched on referencing earlier, but I'd like to go back to it. On page 32, Dr. Bossi writes in relation to Richard Flanagan's book Toxic, quote, instead of accepting and owning the environmental effects and social impacts as acknowledged by comparable overseas interest groups and forging relationships with neighbouring communities, both government and industry representatives have eagerly worked on a line-by-line retort to each one of Flanagan's claims in Toxic, unquote. Well, no, they didn't. They largely kept quiet and ignored it. But I did a line-by-line retort to each of Flanagan's claims, and I appreciate the recognition of a reference, Dr. Bossi, if you don't mind. But in closing this video, I'd like to look at something that's close to my heart. The concept of locals versus blow-ins. You know, those people who come to Tasmania from elsewhere and tell us how to live, making value judgments about us and the way that we live in this beautiful place. On page 35, Dr. Bossi states that contemporary Tasmanian is still emerging from a colonised past. Come on, it's 2025. And while some of us might have convict ancestors, we're no more backward or colonised than any other place in Australia in modern society. And on page 33, Bossi says, quote, "Tasmanians don't choose to live on the island for the city life or healthcare or literacy rates, but for their convenient proximity to some of the most natural and diverse environments accessible to humans." No. That might be the choice for blow-ins who've moved here, but for us Tasmanians, we don't choose to live on the island for those reasons. The majority of us don't choose to live here at all. We've always lived here. Not as long as the Indigenous Tasmanians have, but this is our place. So let's backtrack to that 2014 paper on social licence by Emily Ogier and others, where they say, quote, "A key finding of our research is that, at least in complex environmental contexts, such as the estuaries where salmon aquaculture takes place, the processes that enable social licence rely heavily on the appropriate involvement of scientists. This involvement can link stakeholders, build trust, foster deeper and better informed debate, and perhaps even effectively distribute responsibility. There's no straightforward formula for achieving these outcomes, but we have suggested science can be embedded in inclusive and transparent processes to encourage a virtuous rather than vicious cycle." Unless your name's Dr. Larelle Bossi, I guess. Because from page 1, this is just another example of normative science, starting from a declared stance or viewpoint. Because Bossi draws on emotional concepts such as the spiritual context of the Micmac people and their connection to the Plamu salmon in Nova Scotia. How is that relevant? And then to I'll hesitate to use the word, modern reconstruction of Tasmanian First Nations culture, where the wrong fish with the wrong song. But in concluding this peer review, I've come to the conclusion that this paper is really a pretty shoddy piece of work. Now, I'm not placing all the blame on Dr. Bossi, not by any means, but on the problem with the state of peer reviewing today. In the past, reviewers and publishers would have picked up the factual errors, picked up the emotion, made sure the references were correct, and above all, questioned many of the assumptions. So if you've enjoyed this peer review, please click like, please subscribe, hit me up in the comments below if you want a peer review, the peer review. And I don't know which one I'm going to be doing next. I might delve into some educational science, or I might stick with this theme. Who knows? But anyway, thanks for watching. Catch you next time, somewhere on a pier. Now, if you want to know more about the concept of social licence, you can check out the video of a webinar I presented to the Seafoods. Now, if you... Okay. If he doesn't mind being a star on YouTube. Hello. Hello. Am I still recording that?
A few moments later.
Scientists have a substantial role in the processes that contribute to social licence. I'll take that again.